although the African continent has formerly been out of colonization for more than half a century in most parts of the continent, it is actually disheartening to realize that the African continent seems to suffer a lot. There is a lot that is going wrong on the continent. For instance, you find that there is a general lack of progress in terms of economic development. There's regression when it comes to infrastructure. And then you also come to notice that dictatorship is pervasive on the African continent. There are wars and there's a lot of conflict in different countries of the continent. Meanwhile, the continent also continues to suffer from disease, pestilence, and general poverty. You see, there is a lot that is not going right on the continent. And then this raises the question of why we still experience so many of the problems, in spite of the fact that we've overcome formal colonization with so much fanfare and so much excitement, and yet that optimism that existed at the time of the decolonization of the continent has fizzled into insignificance, because there is actually nothing tangible on the ground to say this is what has been achieved since the formal end of the colonial system. And one of the areas where we need to look at, in order to try and maybe find answers to why there is this absence of progress and development, is the area of education. This brings us to our discussion, which is based on the greatest colonial deception, changing from the African to Western systems of education. The assumption being, if we look at if we review the African system of education as it exists now, vis-a-vis what it was in the pre-colonial system, we might be able to understand why there is still such a dearth or absence of meaningful progress. It is ironic that the colonial experience has been lauded for ushering education into the continent of Africa. There seems to be an assumption that there was no education in Africa until the advent of colonialism. Now, is it really true? Well, there are quite a number of questions that we will ask and we will endeavor to answer in this discussion. Among them, we have a question which says, did Africans have any education before the advent of colonization? Were there any schools in Africa before the advent of colonization? How was education structured in pre-colonial Africa, if at all there was any education system? And how do Western systems of education differ from the African traditional systems? And how has the introduction of Western education impacted the African continent? Now, as we endeavor to answer these questions, we will look at what education is and what the concept of education entails. Well, one has to define the term education the way it has been defined elsewhere. Education is a system of transferring and receiving knowledge, skills, and other essential forms of human experiences between one person and another, and from one generation to another. It is socially organized in that the whole society participates in the transfer and reception of these essential linguistic, social, cultural, economic, religious, technological, legal, political, and artistic skills for the good of families and the whole community. It is a holistic process undertaken to mold and produce an individual who fits very perfectly in the community, as well as, turning that individual into a well-rounded citizen whose contribution to the development of the community ensures its sustenance. Now, there are private and public role players who participate in the exercise of education, which is viewed as an integral element of the individual and community survival. Education can be provided as an exclusive and specialized enterprise pursued in dedicated facilities, or it can be provided as part and parcel of an ongoing life's experience. That's very, very important to take note of. So coming back then to the question whether there were any systems of education in pre-colonial Africa, it goes without saying that there was education in pre-colonial Africa. Every human society has a system of education, otherwise it would not be a society. Language, culture, social values, political values, the laws and customs, the technological skills and the economic skills, artistic skills, are transferred from the senior and experienced members of the society to the younger and inexperienced members of the same society. Taking note that the family constitutes the basic teaching and learning unit, it teaches children or babies from birth, as the baby begins to be taught basic survival skills and techniques prevailing in the society. You find that boys and girls get to be trained according to the division of labor prevailing in the communities. As you will note, in pre-colonial Africa, senior men trained boys in various disciplines such as military skills to prepare them for the duties of defending the community, the chiefdom of the state. And boys were taught hunting skills, fishing, animal husbandry, crop production, just to prepare them for fatherhood, while senior women taught girls skills related to baby minding and upbringing skills, that is child upbringing skills, to prepare them for motherhood. Girls learned housekeeping and maintenance skills. Nursing skills were also taught to women to ensure proper care for the weak and the sickly. For instance, you'll notice that almost every elderly woman was a midwife, because as she participated in childbearing, she also learned skills of midwifery, because later on, as a senior member of the society, she would be expected to help the younger women to give birth. So education was in a way integrated with the rest of the skills and the spheres of life within that community. The major question then is, were there any schools in Africa before the advent of colonialism? Well, there were private and public learning facilities in pre-colonial Africa, in almost every society. Of course, those schools may not have been as specialized as the Western schools are, but certainly there were some forms of institutions to promote learning. For instance, Bantu societies in Southern Africa maintained age regiments for boys and young men who received instruction in military discipline, hunting, farming, and other essential skills. Boys growing together in one age group eventually formed a regiment which participated in wars of aggression and national defense, while providing a support structure throughout the course of life. For instance, the Xhosa, the Ndebele, the Sotho initiation schools in South Africa are living examples of those formal schools, which could not be avoided by anyone without attracting adverse consequences. So this was a concept of public schools. For instance, among the Xhosa, a man who did not go through circumcision and those initiation schools never graduated from being a boy to a man. He was considered inkwenkwe, or a boy, throughout his life, notwithstanding how old he became. Among AmaZulu, young girls and maidens were instructed by amaqhikiza, or senior virgins, regarding safe sex, keeping one's virginity, the choice of a suitable suitor in anticipation of marriage, among other factors. The Umhlanga dance among the Zulu girls provided a yearly ceremony for reaffirmation of chastity or virginity, and a community meeting of men, or inkundla yamadoda, was an institution which taught men about the law, the politics of the chiefdom, expectations regarding men in society, the accepted and the unaccepted behaviors among men and in society general. Women met and received instruction from the elderly women regarding acceptable behavior in marriage, the expectations in marriage, as well as how to keep and maintain stable families. Of course, there were Izangoma, who were spiritual healers, and Izinyanga, who happened to be traditional healers also, who ran private schools in which they trained future leaders in the craft of healing and spiritual support through a program called Ugutwasa. And now looking at this, it was some kind of a private school, because some of those programs became so expansive and attracted a lot of people through those Ugutwasa ceremonies. And the family served as a private primary school because it provided the primary education, while age regiments provided the secondary public education. So we also come to think of the role of praise singers, or these oral poets, those who composed and maintained praise poems, because now these served as historians groomed in the private and public spheres of life. For instance, each family's praise names contained the history of that family, and that was meant to compensate for the fact that those societies did not have a writing system. So because they could not read and write, most of the important historical information about the family was recorded in oral form and was given recited as praise poems for the family. That's how family history and the history of the community was kept in that oral form. And then coming now to the structure of education in pre-colonial Africa, one gets to notice that education and other spheres of life were interwoven into a single system. Lessons were handed down orally through legends, folklore, through song, praise poetry, drama, quiz, and so on and so forth. Instead of dedicated schools meant to teach people about life and the requisite skills, education took place in the context of life, inculcating experiences which served as lessons while being part of life. Education took place in situ, since boys, learning to herd cattle, goats, sheep, etc., acquired the skills while simultaneously contributing to the family economy. So there was no distinction between education and life itself. Girls engaged in fetching firewood, fetching water, preparing meals, taking care of baby siblings, as they learned the skills of motherhood while contributing to the family welfare. A woman giving birth learned midwifery skills to help the future generation of women during child delivery. We have already alluded to that in the foregoing slide. And the concept of child labor was unknown, because a child providing labor in the family farm was actually an apprentice. seized with the duty to successfully complete a learning assignment, while at the same time contributing to the economy of the family. So it was highlighted in the preceding slide that certain private learning experiences were provided at family level as well as through TWASA, that is spiritual training institutions, while public learning was conducted through public sponsored age initiation schools, as we gave examples of the Xhosa, the Ndebele, among other groups. And skills for family maintenance were provided at family level as well as at community level, whilst military training for men was provided at public level under the auspices of the chief or the king of the community. And some women also acquired military training through participation in the male-dominated fields of cattle herding, because you see there were many women warriors. For instance, one thinks of Nyamazana, one warrior who actually led the a Swati group into present-day Matabeleland, and that group eventually was overcome and absorbed by Mzilikazi, but initially it was led by a woman called Nyamazana. That was Nyamazana Dlamini. So you find African and Western systems differ significantly in terms of their approaches. Of course, taking into account that there was no method of writing amongst Africans, most African communities. So therefore, most of the material, most of the learning material was transferred in the oral form or through experiential exposure rather than through the textbook. Or one then asks, how has the introduction of Western education impacted the African continent? Well, there are quite a number of points to ponder. European systems of education encourage specialization more than African systems do. And this leads to efficiency and greater levels of erudition in the former systems. But as you will notice, the replacement of African systems with Western systems of education disrupted the foundations of the African societies, leaving them, standing on shaky ground, if one could say. And this was sponsored by the colonial fallacy that formal education was known in pre-colonial Africa, and this has triggered an abandonment of these established systems in favor of the Western ones. So you find that colonial curricula designed to provide personnel for colonial systems thus replaced the pre-colonial systems of learning. It is very important to consider that colonial system of education was not designed to favor or to develop the African, but it was primarily meant to serve and protect and enhance the interests and the needs and the desires and the inclinations of the colonial systems. So that it was never meant for the African as such, and therefore the continuance of this these systems by post-colonial African governments and states is actually a disservice, and that partly explains why the continent of Africa is unable to move from the quagmire upon which it sits, because there is a discord between what transpires in education and what actually should be transpiring. So we have a colonial curriculum which is suited to the needs of the colonialists, which does not serve the interests of the post-colonial Africa, with a different set of policy pursuits, because they are significantly different from those of the colonial systems for which they were primarily designed to serve. We have Western education which is incompatible with the fabric of the society that it seeks to serve, and it continues to propagate foreign or alien values which engender more problems in the communities than it is able to solve. For instance, some of these issues to do with gender relations, which have been polarized by a system that promotes individualism while attacking the communalist foundations of African societies, you find that this is a product of the Western system, because it is not able to reconcile the groups, but rather it continues to exaggerate and highlight differences and conflict rather than complementarity. Still, on the issue of the impact of Western education, one finds that the purpose of African education was to build stronger communities for sustainability and not to promote individualistic and selfish desires as the Western system does. And because colonialism was not an episode, but the launching of a system, the inauguration of a system, you find that colonialism has flourished more under the black rule than it did under the white rule, simply because colonial education laid the foundation for the continued colonization of Africa. In other words, Western ideas, Western ideologies, and systems of knowledge, epistemologies, and so on continue to be entrenched on the African continent, thereby supplanting African systems of knowledge, rendering them alien and useless, to the point that the African continent and the African people find themselves alien or foreign to themselves in a way, unable to reconcile their circumstances with the education that they have received. And that partly explains why an African graduate is not able to fit into the community that he resides with, and is not even able to solve the problems that bedevil the community, because his education is alien to the rest of the community. So there's a kind of a discord between what he has learned and the nature of the problems that he is meant to be solving. That's very important, and Africans need to seriously think about that. Because you have a colonial education which taught men and women to contradict and compete with each other instead of complementing one another. Well, we have mentioned the issue of gender polarization already, and we have noticed that it dismantled the social controls by undermining the long established systems of social relations. For instance, you find that in a Zulu culture, there was a lady of marriageable age. Those girls were usually called the amaqikiza. They advised the younger women, or the younger girls, about how to identify a potential husband, as well as how to proceed from the time the woman is approached by that potential husband, the negotiations up to a point where she begins to say, okay, I also love you, and then the preparations for marriage and so on. That was very important, because then there were principles around how to identify a suitor, as well as how to relate with him. And such systems were useful in avoiding all these extreme displays of gender violence that are prevalent nowadays in the South African society. Because a woman would not just get excited with a man who is not known by anybody else other than herself. She would require the kind of a validation by members of a community. So in a way, these young women were protected from predators, sexual predators, if one could say. And we are saying that the Western systems of education, ushered in by colonization, dismantled these social controls, undermined the established systems of social relations, and you know ushered in a great deal of confusion, and endangered the life of everyone in the process. So, looking then closely at all these changes that were brought in by the Western system of education on the African society, you find that, in summary, different and context-specific systems of education existed in pre-colonial Africa, and with some elements of the systems that have persisted up to the present day. We gave the example of Amaxhosa initiation schools. And then you find African communities ran public schools, private schools, and other learning institutions, even though they were not designated by names consistent with the Western classifications. For instance, they were not called private schools or high schools or secondary schools, but they were schools nevertheless, because they provided that education that was required or needed by the members of the community. So Western education differs from African systems in that it maintains rigid taxonomies and undermines epistemologies distinct from its own. In other words, you see, this Western education, yes, provides specialization. Then instead of people learning, say, in situ and on life's experiences, they tend to specialize. It is good in the sense that it allows for specialization and advancement, but at the same time, it has got its own shortcomings. Now, it endeavors, that is, the Western system endeavors to distinguish between education and other spheres of life, in that it marks stages in a person's life when education begins and ends. Unlike in African systems where education is an ongoing life experience with neither beginning nor end. So people learn from the cradle to the grave, from the time they are born right up to the time that they pass on into the next life. Because even while they live in the African context, they are learning also about life in the after death. That is life in the spirit realm, which is believed to commence immediately when somebody passes on or dies in this realm of the flesh. So the introduction of Western systems disrupted the African systems, thereby ushering in systems which are discordant with the needs of the societies that they are intended to serve. And to summarize all this, the reason why there's been a continued overriding of the African traditional systems of education is the fallacy that there was no education in Africa before the advent of colonialism, which is a falsehood in itself. A Vundisa production 2021 with Philani Lithandane Ndlovu. Thanks for your time. Bye bye.